Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning into this episode. And we've had just a little bit of a break in our release of episodes after releasing one every week for almost 3 years. We took a little bit of a break, and we're glad to be back and glad to have as our first interview after about a month break is what we've taken. I have Dr. John Dominic Crossan on Spirituality Adventures. And I just have to say that I've known about John Dominic Crossan for my whole Christian career. I was introduced to him at Baylor University when I was studying. And I remember as an evangelical pastor, when John Dominic Crossan came out with the Jesus Seminar crew, we all thought that we needed to avoid them like the plague, right? And oh my God, these Jesus Seminar people, they're just ruining the gospel, right? And all these things. So then that was there. And then in the last 5 years, Dr. Crossan, I have gone back and reread many of your books. And I would actually now recommend these books to pastors of all stripes. This is such great history. The first Christmas, the last week, I could go on and on and on. But his newest book is called Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So Dr. Crossan, thank you for being on Spirituality Adventures. You are a world-renowned scholar, and I feel so honored. You are 2 years older than my dad. My dad is born in 1936. You were born in 1934. And I'm amazed at how long your career has gone and how influential you've been in the world of scholarship and lay people, because preachers all over the world are using your stuff as they preach to people, you know?
Thank you, Fred, very much. It's a pleasure, by the way, to be with you.
Well, I'm honored. So let's first start with the book, Paul the Pharisee. You start out with 4 matrices. And I thought the first 2, especially the Christian matrix and the Jewish matrix, kind of introduce you personally a little bit to the audience. And I love to do that because you're born in Ireland. And of course, my family goes back to Ireland. So give us a little bio of your personal history and how that ties into the Christian matrix, then the Jewish matrix, then the Roman matrix, and then the evolutionary matrix. Let's start with that.
Okay, Fred, let me begin with that word matrix, because I'm not trying to introduce some weird new concept that nobody ever heard. What I'm trying to do is avoid this disjunction and division between the foreground and the background. And having said it, we ignore the background. Or we're going to talk about the text and the context, and then we'll ignore the context. I want a single word that brings together those two things. For example, if we were talking about Gandhi and somebody said, let's forget that background about British imperialism. It's not a background, it's part of the matrix. Let's talk about Martin Luther King Jr., but nothing about this context of American racism. No, it's the matrix. So matrix is everything you have to know what's going on. Like you and I today, if we hear something on television, we know the context of it. We're in the matrix. All right. Now, I'm trying to get us back into the matrix of the first century. That's all that's going on. Okay. So, for example, in the Reformation, let's start there. You could think of Paul. You could think of Paul. You shouldn't, but you could think of Paul. He was this good Christian who got out from those bad Jews. And it's just like Luther, the good Protestant, who got out from those bad Catholics. Marvelous. We got Paul as a major protagonist for the Reformation. That's what I mean very much by seeing him as a Christian. You're seeing him within the Christian matrix. And it made sense. I mean, it was magnificent propaganda. Paul, Luther, bad Judaism, bad Roman Catholicism. Oh, you had a whole propaganda thing there. The fact that it wasn't true, of course, like most propaganda, doesn't matter. That's what I mean by the Christian matrix. You keep Paul as a Christian. Now, let me move to what I call sorry, go on.
Yeah, but tell how were you introduced to that? Just give us a little bit of background for that Christian matrix. Yeah.
I was born in Ireland, as you could tell from my accent. And in Ireland, I first heard of Paul, and I wasn't paying much attention. Let's be clear. It was the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul. That's all one word, Peter and Paul. And it was very clearly Peter.
Yeah.
Peter came first. Nobody said Paul and Peter. And it was in, June 29th, I think it was. So we didn't care about it. What did we get out of that? It was what we call a holiday of obligation. That means you had to go to Mass. But you didn't get a day off school because you're in the middle of summer vacation. So as far as we were concerned as kids, no value whatsoever. You didn't get a day off. But I first heard of Paul very, very definitely as part of the hero and the sidekick. The hero was Peter, very clearly. The Pope was father, and then Paul, not very important, in other words. So that was my Christian introduction to it. In the Christian matrix, I wasn't even hearing very much about the Reformation, to be fair.
Okay.
It came later. But that was where I started. Okay? Now, the Jewish matrix.
You were an altar boy.
I was an altar boy, for example, at 8. I was most of my life deep in the Roman Catholic religion. I was an altar boy at 8, and I loved the challenge of carrying the great big heavy missal, not the Bible though, the missal, the Roman missal, as heavy as those great big Bibles, and you had to hold it on a brass stand. I was 8. And you're wearing a soutane, which is like a full-length skirt, as it were, and you're walking up steps, holding this heavy thing. And the challenge was not to dump the whole thing and stumble. So I loved it. I mean, it was a challenge for a kid. It had nothing to do with holiness or sanctity or anything like that. It was an adventure. Using a thurible that the priest was putting live coals in. You know, you had to hold the thurible and not set him on fire. You had to respond in Latin, by the way. You had to learn Latin at 8. It was rubbish as far as we were concerned. Wow. But you had to know introibo ad altare Dei. You learned it by heart. Like learning rubbish, but you learned it. So that was where I began. And then I went to a boarding school, not a seminary now, a boarding school in Donegal, which was run by priests who were first-rate teachers, by the way. I had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin before I ever even heard of the New Testament, really. Because in Roman Catholic Ireland, the Missal was the book. Now, it contained, of course, all sorts of stuff from the Old New Testament, but it was in our book. The Roman Catholic Missal was our book. The Protestants had their book called the Bible. We had taken most of it over into our book. The nice big red cover, you know. So growing up, I didn't know about the Bible as any kind of a conscious thing. I may have known about it, but the Missal, oh yeah, I knew all about the Missal. And as priests in the monastery, I entered the monastery when I was 16.
Wow.
Monastery, we chanted 4 hours a day of chant at Tiffany, one side against the other. And of course, it was all from, we call it the breviary, which was all from the Bible. But we ain't reading the Bible. We're reading our breviary. So the whole theory this was the Roman Catholic equivalent. Nobody said that now. But in effect, growing up, you knew the important book, the big book, was the Missal, the Roman Catholic Missal. And as a priest, it was your breviary. So in one sense, I don't know if vaccinated is the right word, against fundamentalism. Now, maybe papal fundamentalism.
Right.
But not biblical fundamentalism. That wasn't on my horizon at all.
Yeah. Okay, so excellent. So the Christian matrix comes from your background and your Roman Catholic background. Talk about the Jewish matrix. What do you mean by that?
Okay, well, as I said, I entered the monastery, and when you enter the monastery, like going into the army, you do what you're told. That's you take that for granted. So they took one look at me after I got in. They said, "Hey, you've had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin. You're going to be a professor." I said, "Sure, whatever." So they sent me off for a doctorate sent me back to Ireland. I was in America at the time. Sent me back to Ireland for my doctorate, and then they said, "You're going off to Rome for 2 years of specialization in exegesis after your doctorate." Okay, those were the years 59 to 61. So there were the years right before the Second Vatican Council, 62 to 65. Those were the years to be in Rome, as Wordsworth said, "Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive." Everything was going to change. We were convinced as a priest in Rome in 1960, let's say, that we were going to have a married clergy. We were certain of it. This was a big change.
Yeah.
What else was going to happen? So when that didn't happen, that's another story. Anyway, I'm in Rome, 59 to 60. And in 1960, let's say, it must have been about August of 1960, the Olympics are coming to Rome, so it's chaos. I mean, Rome was usually chaos, but this was Olympic chaos, building Rome. I was glad to be told by my superiors, go to Lisbon and meet 40 or so pilgrims, Roman Catholic pilgrims, who are going to be going around Europe to Roman Catholic shrines. You're going to be their not their guide, but their spiritual advisor, as it were, say mass and things like that. So I was happy.
Yeah.
I'm going around all around Europe, staying in first-class hotels. And all I have to do is be with these people as their sort of spiritual guide and say mass for them. It was magnificent. But 1960, we went to Oberammergau. Now, Oberammergau, as everyone knows, is where since 1634, every decade on the decades and special times, people reenact the Passion Play.
Right.
Now, this was 1960. Obviously, in 1940, Bavaria had other things on its mind besides the Passion Play. So there was none in 1940. In 1950, it was redone again with Eisenhower, actually, and Adenauer, both present. But it was the same thing that Hitler saw back in 1930.
Yeah, Hitler saw the Passion Play in 1930 at this
1930, before he became Chancellor, and in 1934, the 300th anniversary, after he became Chancellor. He went there twice.
Interesting.
Because from the Hitler archive, by the way, my own, of him being there.
Wow.
And shaking hands with a young girl and everything else.
Wow.
And he said, in a kind of obscene piece of anti-Semitism, this must be shown forever because it shows, I'm going to quote this terrible line, the muck and mire of Jewry and the ascendancy of the Aryan pilot.
Wow.
He turned it into Nazi propaganda.
Wow.
Now, I knew all that. So I go to the play. Well, no, I didn't know about Hitler at the time. I really didn't. That came later. I go to the play. I do know the story. I do know it's going to end. But you start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the whole huge giant stage is filled with people shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna. Oh, they're all for Jesus. Okay, it's about 6 hours. After the first 3 hours, we go off to lunch, 2 hours, come back again, let's say 3 to 6. And all of a sudden, everyone's shouting, crucify him, crucify him. Now,
same crowd, right?
20.
It was always the same crowd did both, right?
The same crowd, because most of the men are involved doing other stuff. So this is heavily, heavily women and children. Kids love it. They get out the stage and shout. So it's a kind of a horrible scene, really. But I didn't know all of that. I really knew the story. I'd read it again and again as text. The first time I saw it as drama, the first time I went back in 2000, by the way, the first time I saw it, I was thinking, what happened during lunch? We left for 2 hours and a lovely lunch, and all of a sudden the same crowd has shifted from Hosanna, Hosanna to crucify, crucify him. I thought, this is not a good story. Something is wrong here.
Right. Yep.
So the first learned article I wrote in Theological Studies, I think it was by 65, was trying to figure out, how did that get so anti-Jewish?
Right.
How did they turn from the Jews all for Jesus, maybe the high priest, maybe? What happened?
Yeah.
So I began to ask questions about history.
Right.
About the theology. Okay, now what would you have seen if you were a neutral observer writing, say, for the Jerusalem Times, and you were there and you were trying to report neutrally on what happened? How would you explain the shift? Or what happened? So that got me into what I call the Jewish matrix. I want to understand what happened in there. Jesus is a Jew. No, he's not a Christian. He's not a proto-Christian. He's a Jew. And Paul thinks of Jesus as a messianic Jew. This is a Jewish matrix. How do I understand Jesus within Judaism? Now, he maybe the Sadducees, who are the high priestly, mightn't like him, but that's their problem. He's still a Jew. And can you be a loyal American and criticize your own government? Of course you can. Can Jesus be a loyal Jew and criticize his own Jewish government? Of course he can, and did. So that got me into the Jewish matrix. You have to put Jesus within that matrix.
Yes, 100%. And then the Roman matrix.
Well, for a lot of people, if they're saying the creed, this guy Pilate kind of descends from heaven. There's nothing else about him. All of a sudden, Jesus crucified under Pilate, under Pontius. Where did Pontius Pilate come from?
Yeah,
Jesus was supposed to come down from heaven. Where did Pilate come from?
Yeah.
So,
this guy.
the Jewish homeland was under initial Romanization at the start of the first century. The Romans had arrived, they conquered by Pompey the Great in around 60 BCE. And that was intensified under the Rome appointed king of the Jews, quotation, Herod the Great. Rome, you can't skip it. It's not only the herd of elephants in the room, it's the herd of elephants running the room. So you can't talk about Judaism in the first century, and therefore Jesus or Paul or anyone else in the first century within Judaism, without talking about Romanization. The Roman Empire and what I would call Mediterranean globalization. That's the Roman matrix.
So couple of things that I've heard you say many times are how when you were in your studies, you were first introduced to Homer and Virgil before you really got into the Old and New Testament. But that's become sort of a pivotal thing for you because it helped you see the history of the Roman matrix more clearly, I think, than a lot of us. Like I started with the Old and New Testament before I ever really understood the Roman matrix, right? And so I thought that was fascinating about your background, that you were introduced to Homer and Virgil and how that helped.
Fred, I want to be clear to you in the audience. Please don't think, oh, I'm so smart. I did that. Oh, no. I was living in small towns, tiny towns, a place called Ballybuffet, which was like a town on a road going through. Okay. And how you get a high school in the small towns of Ireland? You don't. You have a central boarding school, not like the elite boarding schools of England or America. It's a necessity of poverty, if you will, a central boarding school. Now, these were manned by priests, which means they were excellent teachers, not just the random teachers you might find. And though the British were gone, this was 1945 to 1950, they had left behind their own magnificent education, which was geared at Eton and places like that to train their own elites to run an empire. So they started, of course, with Homer and the Greek Empire, and eventually Augustus and the Roman Empire. I don't know if they ever told them, by the way, both of these were failures. that Greece got a democracy and an empire and lost both, and Rome got a republic and a democracy and lost both. So maybe if you were thinking in Oxford or Cambridge, you might have wondered about this. But in any case, I got a magnificent 5 years every day of Greek and Latin, every day for 5 years. Not because I was smart, that's simply what everyone else was doing it. And we were doing it in Gaelic. It amazes me today. I'm thinking in Irish because I wasn't a native speaker. I'm thinking in English. Yeah. I'm speaking in Irish because we're trying to make our generation, go back and make Irish the national language of Ireland.
Okay.
Like Hebrew was restored, say, for Israel.
Right.
And I'm speaking Greek or Latin. And it awes me today, but I didn't think a thing about it at the time. That's what everyone was doing.
It's so fascinating.
So it did mean, though, that I came to realize that Homer and Virgil was the Old Testament and the New Testament of Roman imperial theology.
Yes.
I didn't know that at the time. I was just trying to conjugate a moa, mass, a mat, and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But later, I realized, that's so we have to know that stuff before you even touch the Jewish Old Testament. Otherwise, you'll think, where did this all came from? Descended from heaven. Wow. It didn't descend from heaven. It came from real people, inspired by God, without a doubt, by the Jewish God, not the Roman God, of course. And it was on a collision course with the Roman matrix.
Yeah, for pastors out there who might be listening, your book, The First Christmas you did with Marcus Borg, I thought brought out so much the parallels, contrasts, and all that between Roman imperial theology and then how Jesus is depicted and through language, borrowing from some of that, right? So,
yeah, it was, you could have taken, let me give you an example. You could have taken that Jesus was Lord out of the Old Testament. You could have.
Sure.
You could even have said that Jesus was Son of God out of the Old Testament. David had been the Son of God, Israel. But when you said that in the Roman matrix, the Lord, the Kyrios, the one, was Augustus. So all of a sudden it took on a whole different atmosphere, as if, in the 1930s, you took an ordinary German word like Führer, just means leader. And all of a sudden you started to say Jesus was der Führer. Ooh, that would not be an innocent choice of language. That could have got you into a concentration camp very early in the 1930s if you said Jesus was the only Lord. Wow. So when Paul is talking about our Lord is the Lord, that simple transition from our Lord, Rome had no problem with you having your little lords, to the Lord, that transition is called treason.
Yes.
Or the Romans would call it majestas. And that can get you into serious trouble, even though it's just language.
Yep. Good stuff. So matrix, and then I think the evolutionary matrix. So, and like for the listeners, what's interesting to me about your book, Paul the Pharisee, is that this could be a book read by atheists who still care about the world and the planet and the destiny of our planet. Right. And so you think even Paul has something to say to that audience, as well as to the audience that might identify as theists or Christians or whatever other they might identify as. So I love that. But so talk about the evolutionary matrix.
And that's where I'm pushing the envelope, as it were, by the way. I think most scholars would be with me all the way to the Roman matrix. Here's what happened. In 2020, all of a sudden, I had an awful lot of time to do nothing but stay at home and read. I wasn't going anywhere. At my age, I didn't want to get COVID. So I began to read certain European philosophers who were writing about Paul. Now, European philosophers writing about Paul. Alain Badiou, for example, from France, or Giorgio Agamben from Italy, Jacob Taubes, the German. And all of a sudden, these were philosophers who were saying Paul is important for the present age. He's not just for Christians,
right?
Or he's just religious, or he's not just theological. We are reading him as philosophers, and we think he is crucially important for 2024. Let's put it that way. They were writing at the end of the 1990s and into the first part of this century. So that kind of shocked me. I mean, I read those three authors. I am not capable at all of debating their philosophy. I just read the book they wrote on Paul. And because of that, they inspired me in a way. So I have a lot of quotations from them as the epigraphs of my chapters. It's an act of respect, let me say. But I am convinced I could do a much better job on Paul than they did on their principles.
Interesting.
Not because I'm going to take them back into theology or religion or Christianity. I could say, whether you look at Paul theologically or philosophically, what about evolution? What would Paul be like if you took seriously evolution? And by that, I mean the Big Bang. I mean cosmic evolution, within which human evolution takes place, but cosmic evolution. So the challenge of the evolutionary vision would be, whether you are a theist or an atheist, or couldn't care less about either, you're under, whether you like it, evolution, and evolution has consequences.
Yes.
Okay, well, I don't believe in God, and I don't believe in this punishments of heaven and hell and all that stuff. Fine. But take a good look at global warming.
Right.
And try and decide whether that's a divine punishment or an evolutionary consequence. And I think it's an evolutionary consequence for sure. Divine punishment is theology. You can discuss that. So I'm asking us to go back and take a look at Paul, and in fact, the whole New Testament, and in fact, Christianity, to be blunt, within evolution. Whatever you think about a theistic view, was there a person like God who created evolution? Or you're an atheist, you think, but you don't get rid of our problems by getting rid of God. We still have to face evolution. That's why I want that as the fourth matrix that we have to really try and follow. And that applies equally well to a theist for whom God created evolution, or an atheist for whom there is just evolution.
Yeah. So the threat of climate change, the decline of biodiversity, and the creation of weapons of mass destruction, all are a part of this evolutionary matrix that we're living in that could literally ruin. I mean, it could literally doom our planet. Like,
yes.
I just interviewed Brian McLaren a couple of months ago on his new book, Life After Doom, which he tackled climate change and all that stuff. And yeah, so we all live with that, whether we believe in God or not. And
what happens for me is that if I look at Homo sapiens, our species, and I look at acceleration, especially accelerated weapons of mass destruction, accelerated lack of biodiversity, accelerated change, not just climate change, which could be happening slowly by itself, but accelerated. In the Bible, they're very much worried about war. They talk about beating your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hook. They really don't have a clue, of course, about what we know about accelerated climate change. They don't see that as a threat, but that might be lapping the threat of weapons of mass destruction. I am not sure about that, which is the most pressing contemporary threat.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to know.
Oh, check the evening news every day.
Right.
So if you look at the history of our species, the simple question is, are we a sustainable species? That's all.
Yeah. So let's move into the tale of two metaphors, and give us so I love this, your work on ascension versus resurrection. By the way, the last two Christmases, I've relied heavily on your first Christmas book in my preaching to lay people. And I have also, I tried to get the coffee table book of your work, and I couldn't get it last Christmas. And so I ended up downloading it, online, and I pulled the pictures out because I used some of your pictures, and even in my popular sermons, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I'm advising people to do. The coffee table book, the 4-color book, is very expensive. I'm kind of very proud.
Get one still, but I couldn't find one. Just 8 months ago, I couldn't find one. Yeah.
The first run was so expensive. I think when they were all sold out, that's it. It never went to a soft cover. But we're talking about the book Resurrecting Easter, how the West lost and the East kept Eastern Christianity. The original Easter vision, and that'll get us into what you're talking about.
Yes.
I am advising people, get the Kindle version.
That's what I did, yeah.
And then if you want to give a course on it, even project it onto a screen, you can just take the images, go through the images.
Yeah.
Be careful, because there's copyrights, not from me, but from the Vatican and all sorts of other places where I had to get copyrights. Some of those images cost €200 to use. And they're so small, you can't see them. So put them on your screen.
Right.
If you buy it, nobody can stop you doing that. So anyway, let me come back to the crucial thing. I'm going to go back a little bit, because so much of this, honestly, has happened to me, not because of just thinking my way through it, but something happens to me and forces me to think. Example, I told you we were going with Marcus Borg from 2000 until 2014, and Marcus's lamented death. We used to go every year in search of Paul around Western Turkey. Okay. Now, what happened was, each of us gave a half an hour lecture at night. And so we weren't doing the same thing. I used to try and connect my lecture with what we saw during the day. So now we were there for Paul, the ruins of the Roman Empire, as I said. But we also went into Byzantine churches. Of course, they were there. You're not going to skip Cappadocia or the Kora Museum in Istanbul because Paul wasn't there. So you have this magnificent image of the resurrection. Now, it's not what you expect from the West. It's not Jesus coming out of the tomb looking magnificent, triumphant, gorgeous. We know the thing that the soldiers are cowering or they're looking up, and we know the image. Now, in the West, that's the image of Easter. In the East, again and again, everywhere we went, and then when we started going by ourselves, you have Jesus taking Adam and Eve, that's the human race, by the hand, and liberating them from death, from Hades, not from hell, from Hades. And it says above it, in case you don't know what's going on, He Anastasis, or He Christou Anastasis. It's the resurrection. But it ain't the Western one. It's the Eastern one. And, after about 14 years of this and another 4 years of doing it ourselves all over Europe, we were convinced, and Sarah and I wrote that book, she did the imagery and the graphics. If Paul had been asked by the Corinthians, Paul, we know this crucifixion stuff you're always talking about. We've seen slaves crucified. Tell us about this resurrection. If we were there, what would we have seen, Paul? Draw us a picture. as it were. Would Paul have drawn something like the Western or like the Eastern image? And I was convinced he would have drawn something like the liberation of the human race, or what he called in Greek, anastasis nekron. That's plural. The rising up of the dead ones, not the dead singular, nekron. And Jesus has started that process. So I was really thinking about Paul, of course, but I was also thinking about the resurrection of Jesus. In Paul, but of Jesus. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was kind of part of the historical Jesus for me. Can you really skip the resurrection if you're writing about the historical Jesus? If you don't think it's literal, but you think it's a metaphoric, and I'll get to that in a second, does that mean you can skip it? How could you skip the story of Caesar Augustus burning to death and his spirit going up to eternal life among the gods? Could you skip that and say, oh, that's all theology or something? No, you can't skip it. No classicist I know would skip it. You mightn't believe in it, but the Roman Empire did. So that's 60 million people or something like that. So yeah, you have to talk about it. Anyway, so come back to your question. Sorry, that was long-winded. The metaphor.
Go ahead.
The metaphor of ascension or resurrection. That was your question. Okay. First of all, they're metaphors, as far as I'm concerned. A metaphor is a way of seeing that, if you live by, becomes reality. For example, in the 1930s, the Third Reich was a metaphor. So was the New Deal, Germany, America, Hitler, Roosevelt. If you start living the Third Reich, we know what happens. But that's reality. It's a disastrous, terrible reality. But it's reality. So is the New Deal. So metaphors create reality. Be terribly careful of your metaphors. Be terribly careful of your metaphors. Be going into a presidential election. Be careful, because your metaphors will create reality.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that, well, it's all perception. No, it's not, because of evolution. Evolution will ultimately decide in its own way whether your metaphor is a sustainable reality or not. So what's the difference? The metaphor of ascension was a metaphor of individual, personal exaltation. Everyone across the Mediterranean believed in its possibility. Moses had ascended to God. Romulus, the founder of Rome, had ascended to the gods. Okay? Somebody might say, I don't believe in your ascension, but you couldn't say it couldn't happen. It was a very personal, individual thing. Resurrection was a completely different metaphor. It had to do with cosmic justice, not individuals. It wanted to know, was the world a just place? Did God run the world with cosmic justice? In other words, my language, would there be consequences? They might call them punishments. I read punishments, cross it out, and say consequences. And so, would there be consequences? And the theory of resurrection was, at the end of time, every single one who had ever lived would rise up and be judged, and then go off to heaven or hell. Now, I don't believe a word of that. But what I do believe very much is when Paul says that started with Jesus. That means that's all operational already. That means everyone who's ever lived, including me and you and all of us, has our own personal responsibility for the state of the world. Not just for my own personal, as it were, I go up and be judged all by my little self. Is there cosmic justice? That's the question. And Paul's answer to that is yes, and it's already operational because Jesus is the first of those of the anastasis necron. That's 1 Corinthians, 15, about probably 15 or 16, that Jesus is the start of the general resurrection.
First fruits.
First fruits, that means heaven and hell is open for business. Okay, I'm checking the evening news, and that makes sense to me. It tells me that everyone who has ever lived is responsible for the state of the world, including myself, in our own little way. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That there is a judgment on the whole human race for how we have lived. Okay, that also makes sense to me. So Paul, I would say, like those philosophers say, is very, very relevant for the state of the world.
I love that. So the metaphor of ascension is the iconography of the West, shows Jesus, and they call it resurrection, but it's really ascension, as a solo flight up into heaven to honor him personally and all that kind of stuff, immortality, all that. But this image of resurrection that we see in the Eastern iconography is always about Jesus raising up all of humanity together, not just a solo flight, but all of humanity together with Jesus is being raised or being brought out of Hades. And so, and then show us how this roots Paul very much in the Pharisaic tradition, because it was really only the Pharisees, if I understand correctly, that really believed in this general resurrection, then judgment of all people, off to eternal punishment or reward. And it was about this cosmic cleanup. And you bring that out so well. This kind of started in the Maccabean period. And that really was a uniquely Pharisee, a doctrine of the Pharisee sect of Judaism.
Yes.
Give us,
that's
very Pauline. And that shows that Paul wasn't, that shows that Paul was rooted in the theology of Pharisaism, right?
Yeah, that's where the title comes. Now, a couple of things. You can get the language out for it. The main leadership groups in Judaism in the first century under Romanization, struggling with Romanization, were, I'm simplifying it now, let's say the Essenes down at Qumran on the left wing. They weren't even going to the temple anymore. They weren't observing the calendar. I'm going to call them the left wing. This is not a judgment, it's a description. Over on the right wing, collaborating with the Romans, were the Sadducees, the high priests. And you don't have to demonize them. They were kind of
surviving. They're surviving.
Equivalent. Okay. In the center were the Pharisees. Josephus says they were the most popular group. I think that's right. And what made them popular? Well, first of all, they were the center, which is very often a good place to be for popularity. But they also had something that the ordinary people must have heard, this vision of cosmic justice. The Sadducees would have said, well, everything's fine. What's your problem? Rome brought justice. The Essenes were running their own little world, I suppose. The Pharisees were saying, there is cosmic justice. God is operational already within the world. Okay, that gives hope to people. The Pharisees must have been, as Josephus said, very popular. Now, in the New Testament, they're the villains, of course, because the Messianic Christics, let's call them, Jews, who were not Pharisaic, but Messianic Christic, were fighting for the center. Now, if you want to see really nasty language, you don't find it against people way out there, but who's closest to you? Who are you really dividing with? So what you have to do is clean your mind out of all that stuff in the New Testament about the Pharisees being nitpicking legalists and their brood of vipers and hypocrites, and they're all going to hell. They were probably saying equally nasty stuff about Matthew, to be frank. But unfortunately, Matthew is in the gospel and Jesus is saying that stuff. But when you read it like you're listening to two rather nasty people running for office, and each is saying nasty stuff about the other. I won't go into any details.
Or you could, it's like an internal conflict between two Republicans or two Democrats or something like that. It's Pharisees kind of bickering with Pharisees a little bit. That's how I see it.
Matthew could have been a Pharisee.
I think Jesus was, if you had to locate Jesus, he probably was a Pharisee, wouldn't you say?
I don't know if he would be accepted a Pharisee because he's not learned enough.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, to be a Pharisee, not just to be a follower, to be a Pharisee as such, you had to be able to read and write. I mean, that was their power base.
Yeah. Yeah.
You say, well, what power base? Is it all talk? No, they could write. Anyway, so when I call Paul a Pharisee, I'm putting him in the Jewish understanding. And if you want to understand the Pharisees, read Josephus. I'm going to say it bluntly, don't read the New Testament to understand the Pharisees. Understand them there as fighting,
Yeah.
But read Paul. And Paul will tell you, of course, in very Greek-style language, as if you were reading Plato, he'll tell you about the resurrection. They believe in the resurrection. But it sounds very much like Plato as he's describing it. But it is the resurrection.
Yeah, so this Pharisee doctrine or theology of general resurrection, judgment, and then eternal rewards and punishment, you're saying you don't believe in that literally, but you do believe in it metaphorically in the evolutionary matrix.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I honestly do. I don't even want to say believe, honestly. You know what I mean? Because that means, well, it could be up for the... It's not that I believe in global warming. I don't know how not to see it. It's like, I've never been to China. Do I believe in China? Well, it's not an act of faith. It's an act of human acceptance of the whatever. So I don't want to bring belief over from theological faith into evolution. I think it's the best explanation we have, pending something better, and we have to pay attention to it. So yeah, I accept it as what we're living in at the moment. And then I put Paul into that matrix. And I'm really kind of awed by the sense of how easy it is. And I'm going to say easy, because I don't feel any personal scholarly need to pull Paul into the 21st century. If he ain't here, he's not here. I'm quite happy to say, well, if Jesus did what Jesus did in the first century, but is no longer relevant, let's give him a nice burial with all due respect. And if you think Paul has somehow betrayed Jesus and, has nothing to speak to us, then I don't have to pull him kicking and screaming into relevance. I'm quite happy to say as a scholar, he's done his job. My own sense as a scholar, going from the sublime to the ridiculous for the moment, my only responsibility is to tell the truth as I see it. If people like it, that's fine. If people don't like it, that's fine. If it lasts 5 years, that's fine. If it lasts 100 years, that's fine. That's not my job. My job is to tell the truth. I think Paul thought the same. But he did make claims of relevance. He didn't say, here's good stuff for the Corinthians. He said, no, here's good stuff for the human race. Okay, I'm going to read him and decide, do I think he's right? That he's something to say to the human race, 2024? If not, I would say he did his job, give him a respectful burial, RIP.
So, but understanding that Pharisee theology, general resurrection, judgment, and then eternal rewards or punishment, as a metaphor, or in putting that into the evolutionary matrix, you see that this can still have relevance for the 21st century, because we're talking about human consequences. We're talking about the potential for human change, the potential to save the planet, if you will, and to save humanity, if you will. I mean, there's actually real things at stake here in the 21st century that this metaphor can play into if we live into a metaphor and that turns into reality, which is what happens with all humanity, right? Over an evolutionary period, we live into our metaphors, then it can affect the way the outcomes of the future. if we live into these metaphors that are rooted in nonviolent resistance. And let's start moving into that. Before we get into nonviolent resistance, I just wanted to mention I ran across this book by Stephen Patterson, the Forgotten Creed, and I love this book, and I ended up getting to interview him, and loved the interview I did with him. He was great. He's just a wonderful man. And I noticed that you brought, as I was reading your book, I kept thinking, man, I kept thinking of Stephen's work, and then all of a sudden you brought it up in your book and referenced him pretty well. And I loved that whole history that you did around Paul, around the silent years, around what was going on at the Jerusalem Council, the Luke Acts story versus, anyway. But we don't have time to dive into all of that.
First rate book. And I read it. Well, I knew him I know him well, actually.
He's part of the Jesus Seminar, right?
Jesus Seminar. So I've heard him speak about it. But yes, I have the book actually signed by him. And it's a first rate book.
I thought so too. But let's dive into the heart of what you're bringing to the table here. What exactly is this nonviolent resistance, and how does that play into Paul, and why is it important for today? That's really where we want to go with you're driving this thing to a point that you actually think could help save the planet if we could live into this metaphor.
Yeah. Otherwise, we've no solution except to accept our non-sustainability. Okay, basically go back to Josephus. Go back to Josephus and the Pharisees. He talks about, obviously, universal resurrection. We talked about that. But he talks about something else. Josephus tells us very clearly, this is not my discovery. All you got to do is read the text. It's online. That between the violent revolt of 4 BCE, the death of Herod the Great, and the Great War of 66 to 73, the temple was destroyed and everything else. In those, what would be 70 years? Did I get that right? Yeah. No, 70 years, Jewish leaders invented and experimented with massive, organized, nonviolent resistance. Now, I mean inventive because I have no knowledge historically of anyone who did it before. Now, obviously, they've just had a violent revolt in which, 2,000 people were crucified in Jerusalem. So that's what makes people think, well, we don't like Romanization, but are we going to keep doing this? And no doubt some Jewish leaders did. Well, we just sort of revolt like the Irish leaders did again and again and again. Eventually, maybe we wear them down, okay? But they also, in those 70 years, invented and practiced. And it's all in Josephus. And Josephus, you can trust him on this because he hates it. He thinks, well, armed resistance, that happens. It's unfortunate. It shouldn't be, but it happens. But this nonviolent resistance stuff, that's horrible. He doesn't know what to do with it. So he tries to say that, well, we only had 3 leaders, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Sadducees, as we say. But then he reluctantly admits, but there's another 4th group out there. He calls them the 4th philosophy as our nonviolent resistance. The classic example, of course, is when Caligula tries to put his statue as a god in the Temple of Jerusalem in 41. He describes it. You can read it. I didn't discover it in the sense of making it up. It's all in Josephus. Okay, now, that's the background, the matrix of nonviolent resistance in which we have to put John the Baptist and Jesus. They are not inventing nonviolent resistance. And Jesus isn't, quote, the good Christian who was nonviolent when the bad Jews were violent. That's bunk. It's dangerous anti-Semitism and bad history. Same thing. What Jesus did was proclaim nonviolent resistance against Rome. It's not enough to say Jesus was nonviolent. Of course, but the Romans did not crucify people for nonviolence. They love nonviolence. We have a monopoly on violence, please. All you people be nice, quiet little people and be non-violent, and we'll build you baths and stuff. So it's non-violent resistance we're talking about. Now, I put Jesus into that. How do I know? 2 reasons. One, Pilate crucified Jesus and never rounded up his closest followers. Never rounded up his closest followers. Josephus describes the execution of Jesus. So does Tacitus, the Roman historian, beginning of the 2nd century. They both mention his execution, Jesus's. And even though they're talking about the followers who still exist at their time, they never say, oh, we crucified another 11 of them too. So if I only had that account, Josephus and Tacitus, they crucified Jesus alone, even though he founded a movement which is still on, but they didn't round up his closest lieutenants, let's say. That's the way the Rome handled a Barabbas, who was in jail, according to Mark, 14:1, with those who had rebelled against him and committed murder. If you rebelled against Rome violently, Rome grabbed the leader and everyone to get their hands on closest to him, crucified them all in a nice long row. So you got the message. Rebels. Not just maybe one runaway slave. Rebels. So the second thing is this. The most famous or maybe infamous statement Jesus ever made is love your enemies. That's as sure as anything Jesus ever said for me, for the Jesus Seminar. As red could be. Now, wait a minute.
Point on this too. I love this. Thank you for bringing this up. Yeah. Go ahead.
Because why didn't he simply say love everyone? I mean, that includes your enemies. Why specify enemies? How does he know that his followers will have enemies? Because nonviolent resistance is resistance against something. You can't have nonviolent resistance if there ain't anything to resist. So love your enemies is Jesus's mantra, motto, as it were, for nonviolent resistance. You handle your enemies.
I love that.
You love them. You resist them. No, you don't say, well, it's fine. You guys just, we understand your viewpoint. You tend to kill people. No. We will resist you non-violently. That means you are our enemies. Yes. We didn't make you enemies. You were there first. But as long as you, dear Romans, do what you're doing, you are our enemies. We will love you. And the way we will love you is not by some emotional catharsis. We will resist you non-violently.
Yeah.
So those 2 things are the most important for me, for Jesus. His execution without the rounding up of his closest followers, and the one statement of Jesus. It's, not even Paul quotes love your enemies. He comes close to it. About praying for them, but he doesn't use that because that stops you cold. Why not love everyone? That's, we say that back because it doesn't cost much, but love your enemies. That is the motto, the mantra of nonviolent resistance. It's simply another way of saying it. So that's how Jesus fits into it. And if I only had Josephus, I would know an awful lot about this guy, Jesus. I know he's called the Christ, first of all, and I would know that's a Jewish term for the Messiah, of course, in Greek. I would know that. It's already in Josephus. I would know he started the movement. I would know he was executed alone for it. And I would know the movement was still going on by the late 90s, according to Josephus, and the early 100s, according to Tacitus. That would give me a lot. Now, I wouldn't know anything about Paul. I wouldn't know anything about Peter. The other person I would know a lot about from Josephus is good old James the Just, James the brother of the Lord. I know about James. I wouldn't know Paul existed.
I think as you unpack this nonviolent resistance, we kind of, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're kind of tying into this Paul's idea of new creation and how we need a new humanity to take up this mantle of Jesus, this nonviolent resistance, to actually save our planet today. We need enough humans around the world to take up this mantle of nonviolent resistance that Jesus taught us, and enact this in the world today to save our planet in the face of potential climate disaster and potential weapons of mass destruction disaster. And how else can we save a planet with 8 billion people with limited, all the stuff that's going on? Am I understanding you? This new creation, new humanity ties into that exact point.
If you take Paul says twice, it's about a new creation. I mean, wasn't that lovely? We'll kind of polish up the old one. That's a very liberal reading of Paul. A new creation is simply the old creation polished up a bit. No, Paul is a radical. It's a new creation. And if you say, well, what do we do about this new creation? The evolutionary matrix insists that nonviolent resistance, it's not some religious idea that you can leave aside if you're not religious, a Christian idea, a biblical idea. It is an evolutionary idea. There is no way we can establish the sustainability of our species by escalatory weaponry. Yeah. Now, I understand, I'm Irish. I do understand how, and I'm not going to give you examples, you know them, how people who are battered by great empires. I grew up in a small island on the lee of a great empire. I do understand how again and again and again you rise up against them. But somebody has to say that may be inevitable. You might even say they're right to do it. You might even say how else can they survive? That's not an evolutionary question. The evolutionary question is, how can Homo sapiens survive if steadily weaponry escalates? So that the empire goes in and with its guns, it takes over from people with bows and arrows, who then learn to use guns, which they eventually use against the empire. But by then the empire has bombs. We know the escalation. Evolution is the judgment. The idea that, well, there's a God who's going to punish us. That would be nice because, well, this God forgives. And besides, there's mercy. That's lovely. There is evolution. And as you mentioned, there is forgiveness and evolution in the fact that we can change. Mm. We are not really, like I say, a carnivore who runs out of carnivore and he can't suddenly shift to grass tomorrow or fruit or whatever. We can change. That's the forgiveness of evolution. And there's a time we can change before it's too late. That's the mercy of evolution. But I don't know how we can stop the inevitable spiral of violence, just looking at past history, unless nonviolent revolution somehow becomes normative. And as I insist, as an evolutionary challenge, not just an ethical or a moral challenge or a religious or a Christian or a theological challenge.
We're calling for a death to violence. We're calling for a resurrection of a new humanity that's committed to nonviolent resistance against this violent history of civilization and our current violent history in the world today. And we're calling for a new humanity to embrace nonviolent resistance and to pick up a biblical theme, which you brought out really well, to move toward this vision of a peaceful, grounded earth with distributive justice. Unpack that for us, and then we're about out of time. So, but
you've summarized the book, and the only thing is, I ask people not to hear that as, oh, isn't this sweet? Oh, isn't this lovely? Isn't this nice and gentle? I hear it as an evolutionary imperative or an evolutionary challenge. That's the way I want to hear it. Yeah. The original subtitle of the book honestly, when I first presented it to the editors and the publishers, was simple: a vision of post-civilization. Because it's not just about Rome. Civilization has worked with these three-front onslaughts, as we called, of escalatory violence, escalatory attack on other species, and escalatory attack on the world. To raise that question of sustainability, yes, when Paul talks about a new creation, it's not just, it's as radical as we can imagine. It's almost, I can't imagine it, to be honest with you. If you said to me, okay, try and imagine to me a world, operational, and there is no violence. I'm not talking about the odd one here, but I'm talking about cosmic violence. I'm talking about violence that endangers the earth. Not talking about, well, there'll always be somebody in a corner somewhere doing something. Okay, fine. But the Romans on their worst day, even as an empire, never threatened the destruction of the world. They really didn't. A Roman sword couldn't take out an olive tree. The olive tree would win. So, yeah, now we can do stuff. So all of that becomes not nice, gentle, sweet language. It becomes imperative. And you've simply summarized in the last few words what the book is about. It's trying to imagine post-civilization. What does that look like? And it kind of blows our mind. Of course, it should. But that's the challenge that we're looking at. I said the editors wanted to change it to a vision beyond the violence of civilization. But yes, but the violence of civilization is not that little part of civilization that's violent. It is that civilization is founded on violence. We will control civilization when we, whoever we are, control violence.
Cain and Abel as a metaphor for civilization, right?
Well, it goes back to the opening of the Bible. The dawn of civilization is in is Mesopotamia. We call it the cradle of civilization. We call it the dawn of civilization, time and place. That's what we invented, and that's where the Bible starts its story, by the way, correctly. Mm-hmm. It doesn't start 14 billion years ago. It starts really with civilization. For all practical purposes, that's what we're still living in.
Yes. Yeah.
Mesopotamian cradle of civilization. We're still rocked in that cradle.
Think about it in terms of, people, Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years, I guess they're saying now. And
we got out of Africa at least, say, 100 to 70,000 years ago. We got out of Africa. Yeah. And within another 10,000, 20,000, we controlled the whole world except for Antarctica.
And if you look at the acceleration of violence from the beginning of alphabets, right, written language, till now, it's a blip it's 1% of the history of Homo sapiens. But we've managed to come to the brink of destroying our own planet within 1% of the history of Homo sapiens in the last.
And faster and faster, because just think of this, for example, the Wright Flyer was at the beginning of the 1903 or 4, whatever it was, Kitty Hart, North Carolina. The Wright Flyer, within 1 century, we had the stealth bomber.
Yeah.
In 1 century, we went from the Wright Flyer to the stealth bomber. Yeah. We are so good at this. We are really, really good.
Yeah.
At this.
I did my grandmother's funeral. She was born in 1898 or 9, something like that. And she was 94 when she passed. So she lived to basically 1993. Think of everything. She rode in a covered wagon from Oklahoma to Colorado 3 times before there were cars. and then she saw cars, and then she saw planes, and then she saw the internet, and then she saw, and it's just crazy what she saw in one century.
One lifetime. I have one scholar said it took, let me see if I get it right, 3 million years to get from a stone weapon to a iron weapon, iron sword, but only 3,000 from an iron sword, they get it right, to an atomic bomb. Yeah, I think that's right. 3 million from a stone weapon to an iron sword, 3,000 from an iron sword to an atomic bomb. It's acceleration is the danger. It's not just, well, if this was happening very, at the pace of it's getting faster and faster.
Wow. Well, you've been so kind with your time. Thank you so much for being a part of Spirituality Adventures. I'm curious, you're 91 now, is that right?
90 and a half. I just, February 17th, I was my 90th birthday. So I'm about halfway to 91.
Yeah. Well, happy belated birthday. What's up next for you, Dom? Like at 90, you're still so sharp and you're so vibrant and you have so much energy. What do you think's next for you? And by the way, I want to encourage everybody, pick up Paul and the Pharisee, but also for pastors, I highly recommend the first Christmas and the last week. Both of those you did with Marcus Borg, but they're great. Like there's so much sermon stuff packed into those histories.
They were intended for that, for Easter and Christmas. And the Paul book, Paul is in a way half the New Testament. There's 13 letters attributed to Paul, at least. He's half of Luke Acts. So, you have to face Paul.
Right.
Face him, as we said, out of the Reformation. So anyway, what I'm doing a lot of work is with visual work, as you can tell, looking at the what would you call it, the virtual background behind me. You can see the image of Caesar Augustus with the triumph and the spear, which becomes his scepter, of course. And over there is Paul, and all Paul's got is his manuscripts and a blessing. And he's over against the world. Look at the world in Augustus's right hand, and victory is on the world. He's claiming victory over the world, and of course, that's the orb and scepter that you know from the British coronation. The other hand is the scepter, which is the symbolic spear. So I've conquered the world with the spear. And Paul wants to conquer the world too with what? With a manuscript and a blessing, with persuasion. Caesar does it with force. Paul does it with persuasion. Violence, non-violence. All Paul is doing is persuade you. And in a way, I'm trying to persuade you about Paul. I have no power of force whatsoever, nor would I use it. So I'm trying to do a lot of visualization of this for YouTube and for giving visual lectures. They're totally from images that we took from traveling across the Roman Empire and the Byzantine world, so that people can see this. So that, for example, if I get out of the way there, you can look at Caesar. He's kind of half naked, because if you're a god, it's so hard to remember to put on your clothes. It really seems difficult, especially male gods. So he's divine. How is he divine? Well, he's conquered the world by force. Okay, that's a nice, honest, clear message in one image. Wow. Get that and you got Rome. Get that and you got civilization. So I'm trying to have people visualize it a lot.
I love it. And I always like to tell my younger audiences, it's kind of like the movies of their day, right? These pictures.
Yeah. Sarah and I traveled almost every year, or sometimes a couple of times, to Europe to get these images. We have half a gigabyte, I think, of images that we can use. Always to show you something, though. For example, I'm not just interested in showing you Caesar. I like his haircut. I've kind of used to have one like it. But look at the image. That's from the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. He's lost, of course, the scepter and the Nike victory. Sarah added in because they're bronze and nobody's going to leave bronze around. They were burned up years ago. But that's the way it would have looked. So,
yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It was an honor, really, to be with you during this time, and I can rest easy this day for just hanging out with you a little while. Thank you so much. It's a privilege, and honor.
And thank you also to Fred and to all the listeners out there in the great cloud of unseeing.
Yes.
Thank you very much for listening and watching. Take care, Fred.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures, and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.